Good morning to most of you, good afternoon to some, good evening maybe to a few others. My pitch is simply this, that assuming that you have come up with the right kind of writing, whether it's um, elegant writing, whether it's stylistic writing, whatever that you would may call, before readers start taking in those words that you have toiled so much to get on paper or on screen, they are confronted with what we call a page gestalt, the overall look of a page or a screen. And if that is off-putting, then they may not even get down to your elegant or stylish prose. That's my pitch. And I'm going to try to show you with some examples what you could do to improve the overall page gestalt of a screen or a page, and to make your writing more accessible through visual means. And this is, in fact, something that I've been working on for quite some time. And effective documents, when I've looked at this definition, that you could see that design also is a part of this comprehensive definition, that we need all these dimensions. We need good writing, good wording, but we also need good design to help people find what they need, understand what they find, and use that information. And document design, believe me, can have a role, as this example will show you. Some of you would have heard of this. There's a massive blunder, and there were all kinds of post-mortem on why this happened. And see, this is how it was shown. Now you could see here, it is not doing a good job of highlighting what needs to be highlighted and underplaying what is obvious. For instance, it was an Oscar ceremony, so why give such a prominent space to that? Whereas best picture, that's a crucial bit of information, why bury it as though it's a footnote? So then, of course, designers had a field day and they came up with alternative versions. And this was one such version. You see here, clear typographic coding or distinction, that we have made use of size. We have made use of weight, that is bold or normal. We have made use of space. We have made use of case. And that's what document design could do. Another example of a good practice. Now, for instance, when we see a typical research paper, of course, it has an abstract. But in most journals, either the abstract is in the same font size as the rest of the text, or even it's smaller. Now, I wonder whether that's a hangover from days where we would copy or photocopy the abstract and paste them on index cards. That space was such a premium then. But now we have removed, we no longer face those constraints. So why not put abstract in fact, a larger font? Because abstract, after all, has more readers than the full text. So I find that this is a good practice. You could always see, thanks to this journal, that they have taken care to highlight the abstract even more than. So these are some innovations, some practices that good design can come up with. So I was talking about a page gestalt. Now you see here, this is the look that if you're confronted with, I wonder how many of you will have the gumption to really go ahead with this. But if we bring in a little more air, after all, white space is always a designer's friend. So all we do is, for instance, we widen the margins a bit. We put extra space between lines. We use structure to signal the intent of the text. In fact, that is, I would say, is the crux of the matter, that document design should bring out the structure, the underlying structure of the document. And that's what we make use of. So that's one example. Even with very minor changes, you could improve the page gestalt. You could make the page more welcoming, more accessible. So how do we go there? Now let's work it through step by step. So we'll begin with letters, that are the building blocks. Then there's letters coalesce, they come together to form words. Words form lines, lines form paragraphs, paragraphs form pages. Then typically in technical writing, you also have headings. You have a whole hierarchy of headings, and then you have the document. And mind you, since we are all science editors here, this is not just rhetoric. This is not just words of authority. It has a good backing of research. So as a kind of research that goes on into this, I want to share this example. That the experiment was to test the legibility of individual characters, and the variable was the typeface. So whether it is Vardhana, whether it's Garamond, whether it's Times New Roman, whether it's Calibri, whatever. So there were 20 typefaces being tested, letters of the alphabet, numbers, mathematical signs, and a few others. And the idea was that each character will be displayed on the screen, and the subject will hit the corresponding key of the keyboard of the test of accuracy. So when given the typeface as a variable, the result was, this was an extreme case, that when Garamond was the typeface, only 10% got this correct, because the two similar looking characters, lowercase c and lowercase e, were so confusing in Garamond, whereas with Vardhana, there was not a single mistake. So again, this is the kind of research that underpins document design. Then they analyzed, of course, how the lowercase e in Garamond looked like, what were the proportions of this, what was the modulation, that is whether the stroke is of uniform thickness all through in case of Vardhana, or it changes as in case of Garamond, and so on. So kind of research that does get into this. Or you take numbers, for instance. Now these are the numbers, but we could also print them in different styles. You can add a serif to numeral 1. You can add a bit of curve to number 7, and so on. But what research did find was that the top versions were significantly more legible than the bottom version. So how do we go about this? How do we choose a font? Because that's the basic building block. How do we? So one is, of course, it should have the characters that we need, whether it are Greek character, whether they're organic chemistry symbols, mathematical symbols, whatever. So depending on the matter that we have, we will need the typeface that we choose should have the broad range or a narrow range, whatever that's required. Then maybe typically in scientific documents, we may have footnotes or references that are typically in smaller print, so it should still work. And similar looking characters, and I'll come to that in a minute, should be clearly distinguishable, because context is not often enough. Imagine if you are giving a URL, or if you are showing a code, or if you're showing a formula. In that case, context may not provide the clue whether it is numeral 1, or whether it's capital I, or whether it's lowercase l. Then increasingly, we don't read just on paper. We could be reading on screen, on a full-sized desktop machine. We could be doing it on a laptop, on a tab, or even a cell phone. So then the typeface that we have chosen needs to be adaptable to all these different channels or media. So these are demanding requirements. So I want to show you an example. A couple of years ago, when the journal Nature went in for a redesign, and it in fact commissioned a special typeface called Harding. And the creative director of Nature in fact admitted as much, that we have best practices in visual communication. It's a mature field, but we need to make best use of that. We need to implement what advice we have from research, in addition to any creative or subjective element that of course goes into design, that the feeling, the flavor that evokes. But in more mundane level, what did Harding really demand? Given that Nature is a multidisciplinary journal, so here are some of the things that they focused on. In order to make characters clearly distinguishable, subscripts and superscripts were made larger, italics more slanted. There was a whole range of characters. And as I mentioned, it has to work in different devices or screens. So just to illustrate this, see the range of characters the typeface Harding has come up with. So you have, in addition to the usual assortment of capital and lowercase letters and punctuation marks and numerals, we also have subscripts, the whole range of subscripts, superscripts, astronomical signs. It's a whole range. Small capitals, I'll touch upon that later. So that's what I'm getting at, that depending on the requirements, your typeface must live up to those expectations. So take a case of required characters. Now, I don't need to say this to European Council of Editors. You have so many accent marks, but our typeface should do justice to that. Or any other range of characters. So we have characters from astronomy, organic chemistry, even musical notation, Greek characters. So whether your typeface has that, or you are going to just borrow it from some other typeface which may not match in spirit to the typeface you have chosen for the main text. And of course, there are subjective elements to it, what we call atmosphere value. What kind of document it is, formal, informal, elegant. So to give you an example here, now take a formal degree certificate. So it's a very formal document. You don't get it easily. You put in a lot of effort. It's given to you at a very elaborate ceremony. You expect it to have a certain look, quite different from something like this. Now imagine if this invitation were to be printed in the font that you see, the fractal font or black letter, the effect would be quite lost. In fact, people do have very strong feelings about fonts. Now, Comic Sans is often reviled. That's in Comic Sans, and see the rejoinder it got. So people do have very strong associations with typefaces, but that's only part of the story. So as I said, if your typeface needs to distinguish between similar looking characters, then that's the test it can be subjected to. Now you can see typefaces like Verdana or Meta, they come up quite well, whereas Gil Sans, for instance, doesn't really come up very well in this test, but it may or may not be required. So it depends. Then there are extreme cases. For instance, as I said, that we require fonts that should work well in fine print. So there's a whole range of, imagine as low as even 2 or 3 points. Or there could be other requirements. For instance, Matthew Carter designed his typeface BELS Centennial, especially for telephone directories, because they made different demands, that it was to be printed on typically cheap paper in newsprint with high-speed web printing presses and so on. So to give you an example of this, minuscule. Now, of course, these characters were not meant to be viewed at this size. I'm only showing you the engineering that went into it. But the surprising thing is, even at as low as 2 points and 3 points, it would be still reasonably readable. So that's font design can do for you. At the other extreme, we may have, typically for posters or headlines. So Quarto is one such typeface. Or things like highway signs, which need to be large, need to be seen at a distance, and so on. So these are aspects of choosing the right typeface. Typically, there are these two broad categories. Now, those of you who are botanists, I give the example of monocotyledons and dicotyledons. These are the two major plant types. The moment you know whether a plant is a monocot or a dicot, then you can predict a whole range of other attributes of that plant. So it's something like here, this major groups of typefaces, either they have serifs or they don't have serifs. So if you look at these terminals, then these are, the lower one has what we call serifs. That these are little cross strokes. And the received wisdom is that for running text, we prefer typefaces with serifs because they sort of help in guiding the eye along in horizontal dimension. So we have these categories of, and these are typically minor, very minor things. But the point is that a single character like capital A or a small case, lowercase a, you will come across hundreds of times or thousands of times. So then it makes a difference. Individually, of course, these are very trivial differences, even as something as little as a dot on the eye, whether it's circular, square, triangular, whatever. So we have talked about individual blocks, that is letters, but in any writing, of course, we bring the letters together. So there's one cardinal sin that you should avoid is this extra space between lowercase letters. That's really destroys legibility. So spacing whether it between individual letters or spacing between words, that matters a great deal. So when you are debating whether something should be set fully justified or left justified, you are making a trade-off. For instance, if you choose fully justified because you want an even right hand edge, the trade-off is that the spacing between words is variable. So you have what we call a loose line with lots of gaps between words and a tight line in the same paragraph. That to me is not really a good idea, because after all, when we are talking of writing, it's not as though we are building a brick wall where every brick has the uniform dimension and every row of bricks has the same number of bricks. No, that is not what happens in any writing. You will have lines with more words, you will have lines with fewer words, you will have short words, you will have longer words. Given that, why impose this constraint that it should all align the right? Whereas if you are willing to put up with uneven right hand edge, but you get more uniform spacing. So spacing is crucial because it has to do with how we read. Now, when you read a block of text, as you go from left to right, I'm talking of not Hebrew or Urdu. So then it's not a smooth movement for the eyes. If you watch somebody reading something from a distance, you will see how the eyes move. They pause to focus at a very small region of the text being read. Technically, this is called fixations and saccades. So we fix on a spot, take in what it's saying, then jump to the next. At the end of a line, we sweep back. So these are fixations and saccades. What is its relevance? Its relevance is to spacing, because as you anticipate, although you are fixating on a very narrow region, you are already looking ahead to decide where you should land next. And good spacing helps you to do that, because the fixation always occurs invariably within a word and never between words. So that's why it's important that you take care of spacing. Next, we have talked about letters, we have talked about words, but the words form into lines. And the crucial determiner of ease of reading is how long the line is. Now, length measured not in centimeters or millimeters or even picas and inches, but in number of characters. We should avoid both lines that are too long or too short, because especially a long line, we might even double up, might end up reading the same line twice, or we might skip a line. Whereas short lines are difficult to read, because every time we change the line, the lens of the eye refocuses. So if there are too many short lines, there's a constant focusing and refocusing, and that gets tiring in the end. It's not like we are reading a newspaper, which we don't read like we read a novel. So short lines in newspaper columns are fine, but any immersive reading, they're not particularly suitable. So line length, and to some extent line spacing, because line spacing also has to do with the overall page gestalt, that if the lines are spaced too close together, you see a very dense looking page, which might be off-putting to begin with. So we should avoid lines that are too long. We should avoid lines that are too short. So what's a sweet spot? So a sweet spot is about 65 characters, including spaces. I mean, it's not cast in stone, but that's on average. You can compensate. For instance, if the lines are too long, you can compensate for that to some extent by increasing the spacing between lines. So how do you control the line length in terms of number of characters? We have only two ways we can do that. One is we can increase or decrease the margins. The more generous the margins, the shorter the lines. Or the larger the characters, then fewer characters per line. But of course, there is always a constraint because design is dealing with constraints. If you use very large fonts, people might ask you, you think, are you are you publishing for neoliterates? If you make margins too generous, we'll say, why are you wasting space? So that's a trade-off, and we'll see how we can deal with that. So one way to deal with that is to avoid, such horrendously long lines, is to use columns. Now you may have single column that's typically in books, some journals. This is good for plain text. Line length does become critical because you have to see that the line length is not too long. Whereas a double column setting is a good trade-off because it gives you fairly shorter lines. You don't have to increase the font size for readability. And it allows you some flexibility in placing non-text elements like tables or figures or photographs and so on. And these two columns don't always have to be of equal width. Later on, I'll show you examples. You can have two columns, a narrow column reserved for headings and footnotes maybe, and a wider column for running text. You could have even have three columns, but that gives a more magazine-like look. But it allows you more play for all these adjuncts, photographs, diagrams, tables, pull quotes. So we can see some examples of these. Now that's a fairly staid looking page with fully justified settings. So even right hand edge, a little generous margins, headings well signaled, but it's a single column. It's also a single column, but you could see that the publishers have gone in for left align only. So you have more uniform space between words. And paragraphs are signaled in both these examples by having extra space between paragraphs. So that's another trade-off we need to come to, because we have dealt with letters, we have dealt with words, we have dealt with lines. Now we talk about paragraphs. So as I said, it's a good use of three column setting by bringing in all these examples, pull quotes and graphics and so on. Whereas here I would say it's not really a good use of three columns because it's all text. And especially if you see at the references. Now references, they're bound to be, if you use a very narrow setting for references, there'll be too many turnover lines. So why even insist that references should also conform to this three column format? They could be set in double column or even single column. So I was talking about how do you signal new paragraphs? So when you signal them with extra space, as against indenting the first line of the paragraph, then you can run into a problem. Now take this paragraph. Now, if this were to be the last paragraph on the page, and the last line of this paragraph is as long, almost as long as the rest of the lines, so how can you tell whether what follows is a new paragraph or not? Whereas with first line indent, it doesn't matter whether it falls on a new page also. So these are the trade-offs that one needs to keep in mind. Then there are other problems with this using space as a marker. Take this example. Now there's heading and there's a paragraph that follows, but the next paragraph is separated by line space. Now visually what it looks like is that a heading applies only to the first paragraph, the paragraph that immediately follows the heading, which is in fact not the case. The headings has, in fact, it applies to 3 paragraphs, but spacing doesn't make that clear. Visually, it still looks like it applies only, it goes only with the first paragraph. In technical documents, in research papers, we have a hierarchy of headings. So we have, especially the IMRAD structure, we have introduction, methods, results. So we need a way to establish this hierarchy of headings. So we have text, subtext, smaller font, going all the way to chapter title. So any scheme of headings that we adopt should make it absolutely clear what is the level of the heading. And so how do you do that? We have various cues for that. We may use space. For instance, anything that is surrounded by a lot of empty space becomes more prominent. Even when it is not larger, even when it is not bold, space does the job. Second cue we can use is we can use alignment or indent. You said something close to the margin, you said something away from the margin, you said something centered, so that's a cue. You could use a different typeface. You can use one for the text and another for headings. That's a cue. You could use size. You can make headings larger. You could use weight. You could use posture. So any of these and a combination of these we could use to signal our hierarchy of headings. And of course, you could use color. So long as, of course, you know that in print, on paper, of course, color is an expensive proposition. But if you are only digital, it doesn't matter. You can be quite free with color. So it's simply a few examples of how different publishers set up this hierarchy of headings. So here there is numbering plus typographic coding, or there could be, for instance, the title is in all capitals, and then there is first level headings are again in capitals, second level headings is title case. So different means. Now in this case, these are what we call running heads. That is, the following text continues on the same line as the heading. So that's a running heading. Here it's bold, it's doing that job. I mentioned to you a narrow column and a broader column. That's an example of this. So you have 2 columns, the narrow column devoted for headings, so it makes it very easy to scan. People will crib that this is a waste of space, which not always, because by shortening the line for the running text, you are able to make do with a smaller font. So there are trade-offs. Or you could use spacing and indents, posture, weight, if something is bold, something is italics, or you could use positioning and so on. Now there's one small difference here. I have found that in European practice, the first line that follows a heading is not normally indented. The second and subsequent paragraphs have the usual first line indent, but the line that immediately follows a heading is not normally indented. Unlike many publishers in the US, where they would uniformly indent the first line of the paragraph, whether it follows a heading or not. It's a trivial difference. First line is not indented, but subsequent paragraph first lines are indented. As I said, you could.
Yateen, can I just let you know you're on your time, so I don't know if you can just pick up your most important points.
Another 3-4 minutes I have.
Okay.
So I'm almost done. So you could see another error that you should never do is to put equal spacing before and after a heading. That's never a good cue. It has to be more space above and less space below. That's crucial. More space below always works better because it signals the headings. Now headings, at times they are too cramped. That's not a good idea. Or whereas you can use centered, but for that the heading needs to be short, otherwise it won't work. Run-on headings, as I said, why do you need punctuation marks. You can do as well without just space. That works equally fine, but you need to be consistent. Now here you have one run-on heading followed by a full stop, where another runs into a sentence. That's not being consistent. And you can have an extreme case where everything is run-on. Nor should you make them too large compared to the body size. That's another device. Effective use of color. Yes, you have made good use of color. Whereas here I would say it's not particularly good use of color, because you could have achieved the same effect with something else. You also need to take care of spacing so that everything sits on the same baseline. Title case is not really a good way, because you don't know which words to capitalize, prepositions, short words, long words, and simply they are not salient enough. We don't register them as separate headings. So I want to conclude with a few cues of what is good refined typography. So one is good use of small caps. There are fake and small caps. Fake meaning they are too light. They're simply substituted with smaller font, but you see in the second line, the color is more uniform and it's spaced. So that's one cue. Then brackets, sometimes the letter within that follows a bracket, if it's lowercase, it appears centered. So we have typefaces that accordingly move the baseline accordingly. That's a. Then ligatures, you have letters that are close together, but they can be substituted with special characters. Spacing between punctuation marks, that's crucial. Numerals, you have two different types of numerals. You have numbers that have same width, so they line up, or they don't line up. So depending on that. So these are, I would say, some cues of good typography. Size specific, it's not as though you can scale a font. You can see that the 6-point font is sturdier, denser characters, wider characters, whereas 72-point font is thinner characters. So all these matters. Even the spacing has to be good enough. Some characters appear close together, some characters appear wide apart. That needs to be fixed. Lastly, research. Does it all matter? Yes. People who were exposed to good quality text, good quality in terms of appearance, frowned less and performed better on a subsequent cognitive tasks. So there is good research for all that. And I want to close with these observations that were made by judges for these awards for typographic excellence. You can see that the detail has to be, the devil is in details. So that's, lastly, this is a simple example what you could do with creative design. Just a simple example. If you have references, why not set this way? Do away with the initials, make them into 2 columns, make the titles bold so they appear more scannable. Something to leave you with a thought. I want to close with resources, so I'll just run through these. There are websites, there are good books, and I've given you bibliographic details of these books, publishers and editions and so on. So I want to leave you with this thought. Thank you very much.